Hello, you're listening to On Israel in Al Monitor. I am Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv. As we sit in our warm, dry homes, millions of Ukrainians are experiencing cold, hunger, and above all, despair. Both sides keep upping the ante. Zelensky sees himself as a modern-day Churchill, but could end up more like Che Guevara. Putin is dragging his nation back to the Dark Ages. Prime Minister Bennett has appointed himself as a mediator between them, a role that's making some Israelis very unhappy. His government is torn between wanting to stand on the right side of history and what it regards as a vital national interests. At stake is not only Israel's campaign to oust Iran from Syria, where Russian forces are deployed, but also the fate of 250,000 Ukrainian Jews, most of whom have families and friends among Israel's large post-Soviet immigrant community. The collapse of the Soviet Union set off a tsunami of Jewish immigration from Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet republics, deeply impacting every facet of life here. Israel now sees another opportunity to provide homes for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of traumatized Jews fleeing Ukraine and Russia in keeping with its core mission of serving as a heaven for Jews of the world. The Prime Minister's office describes Israeli policy as measured, seeking a precarious balance between keeping Putin sweet and ensuring its alliance with the liberal Western world doesn't turn sour. Has this policy been successful? Too soon to say. We will be discussing this, the war in Europe, and the feelings of the 2 million strong Russian-speaking community in Israel with former Knesset member, journalist and researcher Ksenia Svetlova. Born in Moscow, Svetlova's family immigrated to Israel after the Soviet collapse. She is fluent in Russian and Arabic and Hebrew and English, has covered the hotspots of the Middle East as a journalist and analyst. She was elected to the Knesset on the ticket of the center-left Zionist camp and served as a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She is currently a program director at the Mitvim Institute for Regional Foreign Policies and a fellow researcher in the Institute of Policy and Strategy at the Reichman University. Ksenia Svetlova will be with us right after this short break.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber and Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
I'm privileged to say hello and thank you for joining us here on Israel in Al Monitor. My colleague Ksenia Svetlova, former Knesset member. Shalom, Ksenia, and thank you for joining us here.
Shalom, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I want to ask you first, would you share with us some of your personal feelings about looking at this war, at the atrocities in Mariupol, in Kiev, in Lviv, as someone who grew up in Moscow and has made her home in Israel?
Well, what can I tell you, Ben? I feel that I'm so stunned, and this is such a trauma because indeed, I grew up in Moscow, and I have a lot of friends and even relatives who still live there. But I'm also very attached to Ukraine, and I have also friends there who are actually a member of Russian opposition, who made their home in Kiev, and they escaped, they ran away from the atrocities of Russian regime in Russia, and they chose to make their homes in Kiev, and they were working there, but they were very dedicated. There were a lot of journalists, and now it's all ruined. And I can tell you that I cannot even start to process what is happening, and I'm just making myself very, very busy with helping people to evacuate, with writing about what is happening, with connecting people with each other, getting some help to those who need it, and stuff like this.
Do you think Israel's interests, Russia's presence in Syria, and the many thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews in the war zone justify its policy of playing both sides of the fence?
I have to tell you first that it may seem now that Israel's concern is, first of all, its security, and that it operates regarding to what is happening in Syria and trying to protect its interests vis-a-vis Russia. But frankly speaking, even in 2014, 8 years ago, when Putin took the first bite of Ukrainian sovereignty and annexed Crimea, back then, Israel also didn't denounce Russia's demeanor, and it was pressured very hard by Obama administration, but it just refused totally to do so, even though Russia was still not involved military in Syria. So I think this policy of sitting on both chairs, it's not justified. It was not justified in 2014. Of course, it's not justified now, when there are thousands and thousands of Jews, among, of course, with thousands and millions of Ukrainians who are being murdered in their houses, who are sitting in shelters, who are trying to evacuate despite the fire that is being shot on them. And most of all, I think it's not justified because Israel is a democratic state and it's obliged to be on the right side of the history, as they say.
President Putin seems bogged down in the Ukraine mud. According to initial assessments, the Russians were supposed to have conquered Kiev within 48 hours. It's been 3 weeks and Kiev is still in Ukrainian hands. Putin seems to have wanted a repeat of his Crimean victory in 2014 and is instead facing a repeat of his Chechnya disaster. How do you see Putin at this point in time, more dangerous than he was at the beginning or less? Is he trying to find an acceptable end to the war, or is he determined to keep going until he bombs all of Ukraine into rubble?
I do not know whether he had this kind of idea that it's possible to take over the whole of Ukraine in a couple of days and topple the government in the yes. So then his chief of staff, as well as all of his military advisors, should be fired in this very second. But I can tell you that step by step, he is achieving his goals. Despite the Ukrainians' victories and despite the Ukrainians heroically defending their homeland. But he is succeeding in conquering the eastern and the southeastern part of Ukraine, and probably he will attempt to detach it from the rest of the country. He needs his victory image, so he will not, I think, give up conquering Kiev, or at least bombing it to rubble, because this is what he does already with Kharkiv and with other Ukrainian cities. I think that the assessment of his danger has grown tremendously in the West. 3 weeks ago, just a few people believed that he will actually go all the way. Now we have these discussions of the possibility of tactical nuclear weapon that might be applied against Ukraine. So, of course, I believe that, yes, he is dangerous. He is more dangerous, perhaps, that many people assessed. And he might want to go all the way just to make a point, because he needs to rally his people, his base at his home. and nothing short of some kind of victory, so because he basically put very wide goals. What is denazification? You don't know it, I don't know it. What does he mean by this? What does he mean by demilitarization? What does he mean by punishing of the Nazis and all of the extreme right wing in Ukraine? If he believes that also Zelensky government is part of the extreme right wing and Nazi, then he will go after them. It might take time, but seemingly he is determined to achieve his goals. But even it will be a long military adventure.
I seem to remember that at the beginning of this crisis, you spoke about the decisive impact of sanctions on Putin. The speed and extent of the sanctions do indeed appear to have surprised him. Do you see them as a game changer? Could they endanger his hold on power? Or maybe can the West win without firing one bullet, just putting the Russian economy on its knees?
Sanctions will not save Ukraine. I can tell you that for sure. They will not stop the carnage. Sanctions are for long term. And if Iran succeeded to stand up and to continue maintain, its regime and its policies, and even expand them, if North Korea succeeded to do this, there is no reason, despite this package being really an extensive and unprecedented package. Nothing of a kind had happened to a country that was so ingrained in Western and global economy so far. But we have to be realistic. This will not prevent Putin from bombing now Mariupol and Kharkiv and Chernigov and Kiev, and it will not stop the occupation of Ukraine. So in the long term, I think that yes, there is a potential for weakening Putin's regime. There is a potential to maybe prevent from him to spending so much money on the military, simply because his citizens will not be able to afford bread anymore. But again, it might take years. We do not know what will happen. There might be some game changers from within the, Putin's regime, but this is this is a long shot. This is not something that we can build upon. If the West wants to save Ukraine, it must do much more than just rely on sanctions to have some effect.
So I'll jump with you straight to the next question because it's tough. I just interviewed Senator Joe Lieberman, a former senator, a leader, a democratic leader from the United States. He's in Israel, marking 30 years to the decease of Menachem Begin. And he said that NATO and the US should force immediately a no-fly zone over Ukraine. As we all know, Putin will see this as war, as declaration of war. And I wanted to ask you, first, do you agree that NATO has to do such a thing, a no-fly zone? And maybe it might take this local war to turn it into a world war. Because, U.S. intelligence, which has been surprisingly accurate in its assessment so far, is warning that Putin may use chemical or biological weapons. He has already placed Russia's nuclear forces on alert, as you mentioned before. All these concerns justified, or is he only flexing the muscles that he's so fond of displaying in his Haman photos?
Yes, it is indeed very tough. And I do not envy at all the policymakers in US, Europe, or in Israel, because this is incredibly difficult when you are dealing with a regime that doesn't have any respect for agreements, for truth, for trust. And if they said that Ukraine is likely, the propaganda, the Russian propaganda, said that Ukraine is likely to use chemical weapons, it means that Russia itself can use chemical weapons, and not necessarily, if West will become engaged furthermore in this warfare. So I can tell you that at some point there will need to form a policy in regards to Putin's behavior, because it encourages basically everybody with a bomb, whether it's a dirty bomb, whether it's a bomb that they already have the nuclear weapon, I'm looking at Iran and I'm thinking, out loud, because right now there is no opportunity to know whether JCPOA will be signed or not. But if it will not be signed, and eventually they will become a border state, and then they will have the bomb, whether they would want to perhaps replicate Putin's behavior. If the world will not be able to produce some kind of policy that will be able to deter forces of evil, such as Russia, such as Iran, such as other states that might be getting a nuclear weapon anytime soon. And believe me, I'm looking at the Middle East, and there are countries, at least 3 countries, who would want to get their weapon as soon as possible. Because when they look at what is happening, believe me, nobody wants to be the underdog. So we are looking, at future of nuclear race on speeds here in this region, and not only in this region. And there should be a red line where the red line should be. Whether it will be Putin's next invasion to perhaps Latvia or Lithuania, we don't know. But I think that if right now we are already experiencing some partly a global war, then yes, I think West should be much more determined, and it should be ready to also to fight. Because when you need to deter the evil, just as happened in the Second World War, then eventually you see that compromises can get you nowhere. And I think that Putin, one of his assumptions was, at least this is what his propaganda used to say all the time: the West is weak, they don't want to fight, they will never send their forces anywhere.
And he was right.
They want to withdraw, and he was right. Until now, he was right. He was right, because the Ukrainians are being sacrificed basically here for the sake of the red line that was drawn immediately after the border of Ukraine.
And I remember what Winston Churchill said in the beginning of World War II, that Britain had to choose between disgrace and war. It chose disgrace and it will get war. And actually you said the same now about the West's behavior. Let's talk about the Russians. Despite the tight media control and social media blackout, can you sense and analyze the feelings of the average Moscovite about this war?
Just like there is no average Jerusalemite or Teheranian or even New Yorker, there is no average Moscovite. I can talk about the feelings in my milieu, but they are mostly journalists, well-educated, friends of mine that have been to the West many times. Some of them have Western education. They are, of course, shocked and they are terrified about what is happening. They feel very much ashamed, just like the Germans. Some of the Germans were ashamed after the World War II. They want to run away, but there is no place for all of them, of course. And believe me, nobody's waiting for the Russians at this moment, anywhere, basically. So there are those, but there are also other people. I think they are the silent majority that did not support actively the war until now. Now there is this specific moment, short time, I think, of mobilization around the regime, because it is being performed as played out at the Russian propaganda channels as the West is attacking us. The West is waging the economic war against Russia, but we shall be together and we will be strong and we will persevere. There is this kind of feeling right now. There are people who are completely brainwashed by the propaganda, and they really think that Ukraine is full of Nazis and druggers and people who are dangerous to Russia. And there are those who are still undecisive, and when they will feel the burden of the sanctions, and I think it will be very, very soon, because I have information from close friends that there is lack of some medicines in the drugstores, and the other medicines became very expensive. So it will, of course, affect mostly the most fragile part of the population, elderly people, single moms. So in due time, after some time, I don't know when, but when there will be piles of Russian soldiers, of bodies who will come back from Ukraine, and the life will become unbearable, perhaps there will be a change then. At this moment, I think that it is only a fraction of Moscovites or residents of St. Petersburg that leave the vicinity of their homes and go out and risk themselves and protest against this war.
And as a follow-up question on this, I think the people that are mostly hurt right now from the sanctions are the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs. We know, of course, Roman Abramovich, which is also an Israeli, and many others, but we're talking about dozens of billionaires that most of them are in Putin's close secret of friends or colleagues or I don't know what. But now they are running for their money. They're trying to sell their yachts, and I read that the luxurious apartments in New York, and the West is closing on them. Can it affect Putin himself?
I believe that, first of all, there is this concept of the Kremlin towers. It means that there are a few Kremlin towers which symbolize various bases of power, centers of power in Kremlin, because it's not all unified and it's not all homogeneous, okay? So there are various organs of security. There is the army, but there is also the FSB, and there are also the oligarchs. But the oligarchs, you have to understand, they basically lost their war against Putin and his people who are coming from security structures back in the beginning of 2000s. The person who is most associated with this war is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Another one is Leonid Nevzlin, Gusinsky. These guys from the late 90s and beginning of the 2000s, they understood back then what was happening. They tried to work against, and they were just succumbed and they were destroyed. The others who stayed, they chose to rally around Putin, and they became totally dependent on Putin. So maybe they are unhappy now. I understand perfectly that, if you are used to spend your winters in Aspen and in other resorts, so then coming back to Moscow might not be the dream of your life. But from the other side, they are dependent on Putin, not vice versa. So the question is whether the milieu of people who represent the security establishment, the army, the FSB, the intelligence, if they will become unhappy for some reason, if they will understand that, wow, there is a big problem there, and that their personal interests are in danger, then I think, there might be some kind of movement, but not the oligarchs. First of all, I would not pity them. They are still much better off than poor grandmothers who only have $100 of pension each month, okay? And they have to survive on that. And the ruble just crashed, and there is no way that they can get any more money for drugs and for just livelihood and so on. So I think that the salvation will not come from people like Abramovich or Deripaska or any one of these guys who were crying now so hard for their money, which is actually not theirs at all.
Okay, let's say something about the other side, the Ukrainians, and President Zelensky is supposed to respond somewhere, somehow, soon to Russia's conditions for ending the war. Although Russia seems to have moderated some demands, Zelensky will still have to give up Donbas, declare Ukrainian neutrality, and commit to stay out of NATO, etc. If you were advising him, what would you say?
Well, I'm always very wary with advising people who are much smarter than me. And I would just say that he has to do what is right for Ukraine. And nobody knows exactly what the Putin offers was, because many of the things that are coming from Russia, you have to understand that it's disinformation, that it's merely propaganda, and that basically this kind of negotiation should only start after the ceasefire. In any condition, you do not have the political negotiation when the bombs are exploding at citizens' houses. So you first negotiate on the ceasefire, and then when there is quiet, when people can have the relief, then you talk about politics. I do not know what is actually on the table, because we first of all, we hear conflicting messages all the time. Some come from the Russian MFA, and others come from the talks in Belarus. And there is another thing that was coming up from the negotiations, attempt of negotiations and mediation with Prime Minister Bennett. But I think that only Zelensky knows what really was proposed to him. And he has to choose very wise, because he must know that to make a compromise with a bear is very dangerous. He can take your finger and then immediately you will lose your hand. You will not even feel it. How quickly will it happen?
When I spoke to the Prime Minister's people here in Israel, they said that only Zelensky can decide. We cannot advise or tell him anything. The only one that knows exactly, like you said just now, Ksenia, what is good for Ukraine is him. And I think he became within one day the most popular leader in the world, and also the most lonely leader in the world. And can you tell us, say something about the Israeli attempts to mediate? Do you think Bennett has any chance, or is it just a stunt?
Well, you know, and we know that the Ukrainians, they are interested in having Bennett and also Erdogan, two Middle Eastern leaders who have good relations with both sides to mediate. Zelensky probably believes that these countries will have a better chance with Russia than the Western countries, who are perceived as part of the collective West, and they also condemn Russia very strongly, and they're also part of the, of course, sanctions effort and all of that. But unlike Turkey, it's important to say it, I think, Turkey is having a much more independent line on Russia and Ukraine. Yes, it sells its drones to Ukrainians. It closes the Black Sea, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus to Russian ships. It doesn't join the sanctions, but it also express, condemnations and is dissatisfaction with the situation. Israel is trying to walk, on the thin ice, not to anger anybody. I'm not certain that, giving this feeling of, cautiousness and perhaps, being afraid of angering the bear too much, that it's a good background to having this mediation efforts. I do not know, but I know that all of the leaks that we saw so far, I think they were very dangerous, that Israel tries to convince Zelensky to give up and to accept the situation that are not acceptable for him. I hope that it's not true. This is what I can say. I do not know what really happened there. Nobody knows. But I really hope as an Israeli that it's not true.
Yeah, nobody knows. And they spoke yesterday an hour, a conversation of 1 hour, Zelensky and Bennett. And so I'm very curious, I have to admit. And finally, Ksenia Svetlova, while it's obviously too soon to know how this will all end, do you think the war could change the world in terms of the balance among world powers, NATO standings, Putin's future, Russia's eroded deterrence, China's policies? Do we see here something historic or just another war?
The world already has changed. Sometimes I'm not sure that we in Israel understand how much, because still there is some distance between us and Europe. And it seems that everything is happening in Europe. You see Germany that is building again its military force ready to sell weapons. You see countries like Finland and Sweden that nothing could bring him closer to NATO. And now they are discussing their joining to this treaty. You see this unprecedented unity among the countries of the European Union as never before. A weak European Union that we all used to say, oh my God, look at them, they cannot agree on anything among them. Suddenly they all agree because they understand what kind of danger is looming, at their doors. Putin doesn't just want Ukraine, it's not his only goal. Of course, he wants Ukraine because he dreams about an empire. I actually penned an article last year and I called him about Putin, and I called him a Tsar without an empire. And it seems exactly to describe his feeling. He wants to rebuild his empire. So where will he stop? The Europeans are concerned that he might not stop before he will obtain some kind of a new security deal in Europe, which will actually mean that Russia will have an upper hand. And this is absolutely incredible. So in this situation, when Europe is changing so fast, when US you have more and more voices that are more confident that the US has to do the wrong to do the right thing and to perhaps more actively support Ukrainians, even if it will mean that Putin will see it as an active part of this warfare. So the Middle East, of course, we will see more aggressive Russia. Without any doubt, Russia that is much more willing to sell advanced weapon to everybody who will ask any kind of weapon. And we have to, of course, prepare to this. And again, I will say it as, ex-MK journalist, Israeli mother. Israel has to choose right. Israel has to be on the right side of this historical moment, whether it's refugees, whether it's sanctions, whether it's oligarchs, and whether it's the sense of unity with our natural camp. And it is, of course, the West.
I'm taking from this conversation the headline, "A Czar Without an Empire." And I hope this word did not erupt Ksenia because he read this article and decided to get himself an empire. And let's pray that it will be end very soon and people will not be killed anymore. It was a fascinating conversation. Ksenia Svetlova, thank you very much for joining us here on Israel in Al Monitor. Now we will take a short break and come back with some final thoughts later. Toda rabba, Ksenia.
Toda rabba. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Gilles Kepel, professor at Sciences Po and Normal Sup in Paris, and author of a number of books and articles on the Middle East. Through my new podcast, Reading the Middle East, on the award-winning media service Al Monitor, we will take a deep dive into the trends in the region with the authors and thought leaders who are shaping how we think about the Middle East. Reading the Middle East will be a fantastic addition to Al Monitor's outstanding podcast lineup, including On the Middle East with Andrew Paraziliti and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit. You can subscribe on your favorite listening platforms. We look forward to your joining our conversation.
Thank you for staying with us. First of all, the first headline that the former Knesset member Ksenia Svetlova gave us here is harsh criticism of the Israeli policy of this current government, trying to hold the stick on both ends and be a seat on the fence. So Ksenia Svetlova said that it is not only the security interests of Israel in the northern front, because in 2014, when Putin conquered Crimea, Israel as well did not rush to denounce or condemn Russia, and this was before Putin was involved heavily in Syria. So actually, she says that the Israeli policy is unjustified. It was unjustified then in 2014, and it is unjustified now in 2022. Democracy, says Svetlova, has to be, as like we say, on the right side of history. When I asked her about her personal feeling when she looks at the atrocities and the pictures and the videos and the numbers of casualties and the refugees from Ukraine, she said that she's stunned and she's actually in a trauma. Many of her friends and family are still in Moscow, and many more went to Ukraine, especially people from the Russian opposition, and many of her friends live in Kiev and in Kharkiv and in all these places, and she looks at it and she tries to help, and she is connected to all the friends back there, try to help them escape or survive, and yes, it's a huge trauma. When we're talking about Vladimir Putin, she says that unlike many analysts that think that Putin is in deep trouble, that actually step by step he is achieving his goals. Eastern and the southeast and east of Ukraine is already under Russian occupation, parts of it, and Putin is planning to attach it from the rest of the country, and is heavily bombarding the other parts of Ukraine. And she answered my question and said that Putin is more dangerous now than he was before, and actually is more dangerous than many people assessed before. And talking about sanctions, she said, although it's a big surprise, the magnitude and the pace and the speed of the sanctions, but sanctions, as she said, will not save Ukraine. It can work in the midterm or long term, but right now, the West has to do something, not only sanctioning Russia because it is too weak in order to stop the Russian war machine. She also gave examples of Iran that survived years of heavy sanctions, North Korea, etc. Later I asked her what would she tell Zelensky if he will try to consult with her, what decision should he take? Say yes to the Russian offer, or go on fighting for the independence of Ukraine? And she said that she do not envy the policymakers in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, of course in Ukraine, because they deal with the regime with no respect of the truth. And but the problem is that at some point that they will have to form a policy, a clear one. And it's important because it's not only the Ukrainian question. Iran is looking at this crisis and may learn from it that you can just ignore the West, ignore sanctions, stick with your goals and achieve it. Specifically talking about this compromise that they're dealing right now with the Russian offer, etc., she said that it's like compromising with a bear. You give a bear your finger and he will bite or take the whole arm. And the one thing she wanted to say to Zelensky is, you have to decide, it is your decision, and do what is right for Ukraine. And first of all, negotiate a ceasefire. Don't negotiate a settlement before there is a ceasefire. That's it for this time. I hope you found it interesting, and we will meet here together as usual next week on the same place and the same time. I'm Ben Caspit on Israel from Tel Aviv. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye.